The chandeliers of Lady Danbury's ballroom threw down a light that was both brilliant and merciless. It caught the diamonds on a dowager's throat, the sweat on a young man's brow, the desperate hope in a debutante's eyes. For most, it was a stage. For Penelope Darthorpe, it was merely a place to be invisible. At 40 years of age, invisibility was a skill she had perfected. It was a cloak woven from threads of duty, patience, and the quiet acceptance of being perpetually overlooked. Tonight, the cloak was a gown of dove-grey silk, respectable and entirely unmemorable, the very colour of a London fog. She stood near a pillar, draped in faux ivy, her posture erect, her hands loosely clasped before her. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire glittering spectacle without being a part of it. More importantly, she could keep a watchful eye on her niece. Clara, at 18, was everything Penelope was not. She was a sunbeam, a flash of canary yellow muslin, all bright laughter and careless gestures. She was the reason they were here. Since the death of her brother and his wife, Penelope had found her duties expanding once more. First, it had been her invalid mother, a long, slow decade of darkened rooms and hushed tones. Then her father, his grief and failing mind clouding his final years. Now it was Clara and her younger brother, Thomas, left in the precarious care of an aunt who had no fortune, no husband, and no real standing in the world. A glass of lukewarm lemonade sat untouched on the ledge beside her. She had been offered it an hour ago by a footman who had looked through her, his eyes already scanning for a more important guest. She did not mind. She was accustomed to it. Her role was not to partake, but to facilitate, to ensure Clara's hem was straight, that her dance card was respectably full, and that she did not spend too long in the company of the charming but penniless Captain Ambrose. Penelope's gaze swept the room, a practiced, efficient motion. She catalogued the details. The Duchess of Leinster, looking formidable in purple satin. Lord Ashworth, already half drunk, and leaning too heavily on his wife's arm. The sea of young faces, all alight with the thrilling, terrifying business of the season. Her eyes registered them, assessed them, and moved on. It was a habit born of a lifetime of watching others live. From across the room, Jonathan Alastair Beaumont, the 6th Duke of Whitchurch, watched her. He was not a man given to flights of fancy, nor was he, at 48, easily impressed by the gilded peacocks of the Tun. He had come tonight for one reason only, to placate his aunt, Lady Persis, who insisted he must make an appearance, at least once a season, or risk being declared a hermit, or worse, deceased. He stood in a shadowed alcove, a figure of stark, quiet authority, in his perfectly cut black evening clothes. His hair was raven black, touched now with distinguished wings of silver at the temples, and his eyes, the colour of a turbulent sea, missed nothing. And they had settled on the woman in grey. He had first noticed her an hour ago. She was not beautiful in the conventional blushing manner of the debutantes. Her face, pale and unadorned, was framed by dark hair, neatly coiled, with a few stray threads of silver that caught the light. It was a face of quiet intelligence, her features composed, her mouth a study in serene neutrality. but it was her stillness that had captured him. In a room humming with frantic energy, she was a point of absolute calm. She was not bored, nor was she resentful. She was simply present, an observer, like him. "Who is she?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble that did not carry beyond the alcove. His aunt, Lady Persis, a woman whose sharp wit was as legendary as her collection of sapphires, followed his gaze. She raised her lorgnette. "The woman in grey? The one who looks as though she has been carved from granite and patience?" "The same," Jonathan confirmed. Lady Persis let the lorgnette fall. "That is Miss Penelope Darthorpe, a spinster, 40 years old, if she's a day. The family is respectable but impoverished. She is here tonight as chaperone to her niece, the little canary fluttering about over there." "Darthorpe," the Duke repeated. The name was vaguely familiar, but unimportant. It was the woman herself who held his attention. He watched as the canary-yellow niece, Clara, returned to her aunt's side, her face flushed with excitement. Miss Darthorpe listened, her expression attentive. She smoothed a stray curl on Clara's forehead, a simple maternal gesture that was both tender and efficient. There was no fuss, no cloying affection. Just a quiet act of care. "A life of service, that one," Lady Persis continued, her tone unusually devoid of its customary acid. "Cared for her mother through a long illness, nursed her father until the end, now raising her late brother's children on a pittance. The world has rather used her up and given nothing in return." The Duke's gaze remained fixed on Penelope. Used her up? He did not see a woman who was used up. He saw a woman of profound, untapped strength. He saw a deep, still well in the middle of a desert. While everyone else was clamoring for attention, she simply was. It was the most intriguing thing he had seen in a decade. Just then, a man approached Penelope and her niece. He was handsome in a slick, polished way, his smile a little too bright, his suit a little too fashionable. Penelope's posture, if it were possible, became even more rigid. The small, almost imperceptible shift did not escape the Duke's notice. "And who is that?" Jonathan asked, his voice hardening slightly. Lady Persis sighed. "Ah, that is the serpent in the garden. Lucien Darthorpe, the cousin, inherited what little was left of the family estate when Penelope's father passed. He has the charm of a cobra, and I suspect the same moral compass." Penelope inclined her head as her cousin approached. "Lucien, I did not expect to see you here." "Penelope?" he said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. He bowed, a gesture that was technically correct, but held a shade of mockery. "And dear Clara, you are looking delightful. I trust you are not breaking too many hearts." Clara blushed and curtsied. "Cousin Lucien, I came to have a word with your aunt," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He turned his attention fully to Penelope, effectively dismissing the girl. "A matter of some importance. Perhaps we could find a quieter spot." Penelope's hands tightened ever so slightly. "We can speak here. Clara, dear, why don't you see if Lady Anne is free for a moment?" Clara, sensing the sudden chill in the air, scurried away without a word. Lucien's smile thinned. Always the protector, aren't you, Penny? But you cannot protect everyone from everything, especially not from reality. What is it you want, Lucian? Her voice was low and steady, betraying none of the apprehension that had begun to coil in her stomach. I have come with good news, he said, his tone dripping with false benevolence. I have been thinking a great deal about your future, your situation, a woman of your years, with no prospects. It is a sad state of affairs. I am quite content with my situation. Of course you are, he crooned, but it is not sustainable. You have no home of your own. When Clara marries and Thomas goes to school, where will you be? A dependent? A burden? I cannot allow it. He paused, for dramatic effect. And so I have made an arrangement for you. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, settled over Penelope. An arrangement? The Reverend Mr. Finch, of Little Hallow, in Norfolk, a widower. He requires a wife to manage his household and assist with his parish duties. He is a pious, respectable man. It is a perfect match. I have already given him my encouragement. He will call on you next week. Penelope stared at him. The sound of the orchestra, the chatter, the laughter, it all faded into a dull roar. The Reverend Mr. Finch. She had met him once. A man with damp hands, a perpetually disapproving gaze, and a belief that a woman's opinion was a sign of moral decay. Little Hallow was a bleak, wind-swept parish, 100 miles from anyone she knew. It was not a marriage. It was a sentence. No, she said. The word was quiet, but absolute. Lucien's eyes hardened. The veneer of charm dissolved, revealing the cold, hard man beneath. You are not in a position to say no, Penelope. You seem to forget that you and your charges live under my roof by my good grace. It was my father's home. And it is now my home, he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. And I find your presence inconvenient. You will marry Mr. Finch. It is for the best, for the family. Forcing me into a miserable exile is not for the best of the family, she countered, her own voice remaining impeccably level. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. His smile returned, colder this time. Perhaps you need more persuasion. You recall your father's last years. His mind was clouded. He was not always meticulous with the estate accounts. I have been reviewing them. There are discrepancies, missing funds, unpaid vouchers. It would be a terrible shame if such information were to become public. Think of Clara. Think of the fine match her mother wished for her. Such a scandal. It would be ruinous. The threat landed like a physical blow. It was not for herself, she feared. She could withstand poverty, loneliness, the pity of others. But Clara's future, the family's good name, that was the weapon he had chosen. And he knew it was the one she could not defend against. Her father had not been a thief. He had been a grieving, confused old man. But Lucian would twist it into something ugly and damning. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were exactly what men like Lucian wanted. She simply stood there, her face a pale, composed mask, her heart a block of ice in her chest. You will consider my proposal, Lucien said, his voice once again smooth and pleasant. "I am confident you will make the sensible choice." He gave her a slight, almost triumphant bow and melted back into the crowd. Penelope did not move. She felt the pillar at her back, the only solid thing in a world that had just dissolved beneath her feet. She was trapped, utterly and completely trapped. The life she had known, a life of quiet servitude, was about to be replaced by one of active misery. There was no escape. From his alcove, the Duke of Whitchurch had not heard the words, but he had read the exchange as clearly as if it were written in a book. He saw the cousin's predatory grace, the shift from false charm to cold threat. He saw the way Miss Darthorpe had stood her ground, her dignity an unshakable fortress, and he saw the profound, bone-deep weariness that settled over her when the man was gone. He saw the flicker of despair in her eyes before she expertly extinguished it. He felt a surge of something he had not felt in years. A cold, clear rage. "Persis," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I require a more thorough accounting of the Darthorpe family. Everything. And I wish to be introduced to Miss Penelope Darthorpe. Now." Lady Persis looked from her nephew's resolute face to the still figure of the woman in grey. A slow, calculating smile spread across her features. "Jonathan," she said, "I do believe this season has just become interesting." 3 days later, a carriage bearing the crest of the Duke of Whitchurch drew up outside the modest London townhouse the Darthorpes had rented for the season. Penelope was in the small, cramped parlour, attempting to mend a tear in one of Thomas's shirts, when the butler, a man whose permanent expression was one of pained disapproval, announced the visitor. His Grace, the Duke of Whitchurch. Penelope's needle froze mid-stitch. The Duke of Whitchurch. She had seen him at the ball, of course. It was impossible not to see him. He was a landmark, a mountain range in a room full of foothills, but she could not fathom why he would be calling on them. On her. She stood, automatically smoothing her plain grey morning dress. "Show His Grace in, Jennings." When Jonathan entered the room, it seemed to shrink. He was taller than she remembered, his presence filling the space with an almost palpable silence. He bowed, a gesture of formal, impeccable courtesy. "Miss Darthorpe, thank you for receiving me." "Your Grace," she murmured, inclining her head. Her mind raced. Had he come about Clara? Had she committed some terrible faux pas? "Please be seated." He took the chair opposite her, his sea-grey eyes resting on her with an unnerving intensity. They were not cold, she realized. They were watchful. He seemed to be taking in every detail of the room, the faded chintz on the sofa, the stack of books on a side table, the mending basket at her feet. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries, Miss Darthorpe," he began, his voice the same low, resonant tone she remembered. "I am a direct man. I believe you are in a difficult situation." Penelope's breath caught. How could he possibly know? "I am not sure I understand, Your Grace." "Your cousin, Mr. Lucien Darthorpe," the Duke stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "He is attempting to compel you into a marriage you do not desire." The bluntness of the statement stole the air from her lungs. She could only stare at him, her carefully constructed composure threatening to crack. She had told no one. Clara knew nothing of it. How could this man, this practical stranger, know the precise and private nature of her despair? "My man of business is very thorough," he said, as if in answer to her unspoken question. "When something, or someone, catches my interest, I make it my business to be informed." Shame, hot and sharp, washed over her. Her private humiliation was now a subject of investigation for this powerful man. She was a specimen to be examined. "Your Grace, my family's affairs are of no concern to you." "I wish to make them my concern," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I overheard your cousin at the ball, or rather I observed. I do not believe a woman of your character should be subjected to the whims of a man like him. Something in his tone, a note of genuine, unadorned respect, cut through her defensiveness. He was not pitying her. He was acknowledging her. "Be that as it may, Your Grace, there is nothing to be done," she said, the words tasting of ash. "He holds all the cards." "Perhaps not," the Duke said. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Darthorpe. A business arrangement, if you will." Penelope waited, her heart beginning a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. "I am in need of a wife," he said, the words delivered with the same directness as if he were discussing the weather. "A duchess. I have no interest in a young, flighty girl who will expect poetry and romance. I have a large estate, Raven Knoll, in Northumberland. It is neglected. It requires a mistress with a steady hand and a practical mind. It requires a hostess of dignity and intelligence. It requires, in short, someone like you." Penelope's mind went utterly blank. The mending lay forgotten in her lap. The Duke of Whitchurch was proposing marriage. To her, a 40-year-old spinster with no dowry and a blackmailing cousin. It was absurd. It was impossible. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "I am never anything but serious, Miss Darthorpe. This would be a marriage of convenience, in the truest sense of the term. In return for your services as my Duchess, I would offer you my name and my protection. Your cousin would no longer have any power over you. Your niece's future would be secure. You would have your own household, your own funds, and complete sovereignty over the domestic running of my estate. Raven Knoll would be your domain. Your freedom would be absolute." He paused. "I do not offer you my heart, for it is not mine to give. But I offer you my profound respect, and I offer you an escape." Escape. The word hung in the air between them, shimmering with impossible promise. Escape from Mr. Finch. Escape from Lucian. Escape from a life of being a perpetual dependent, a burden. He was offering her a fortress, a kingdom. But what was the price? To be the wife of this cold, formidable man, to live in a remote northern estate, a stranger in a strange house. It was a different kind of exile. And yet, when she looked at him, she did not see a tyrant. She saw a man who looked at her and did not see a drab, overlooked spinster. He saw a woman of character. He saw a practical mind. He saw her. Why? Why her? "Why me, Your Grace?" she asked, the question rising unbidden. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost. "Because at Lady Danbury's ball, you were the only person in the room who was not performing. You were simply being. I find that I have grown weary of performances. I require authenticity. You are, if I may say so, the most authentic person I have met in a very long time. Authenticity. No one had ever called her that. They had called her dutiful, plain, quiet, reliable. All words that meant useful. He was the first person to name a quality that was intrinsically hers, not something she did for others. She looked down at her hands, at the needle and thread. Her entire life had been about mending things for other people. Mending clothes, mending feelings, mending the gaps left by death and despair. He was offering her a life that did not need mending. A life that was whole. It was a choice, a real choice, between a prison designed by a man who despised her and a sanctuary offered by a man who respected her. Her decision, when it came, was as quiet and absolute as her refusal to Lucien. She raised her eyes to meet his. "Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I accept your proposition. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." They were married 2 days later by special license in a dusty, sun-drenched church in Mayfair. Lady Persis and a grim-faced solicitor were the only witnesses. Penelope wore a travelling dress of deep blue wool, a practical garment she had made herself years ago. There were no flowers, no music, no fanfare. It was a transaction, and it was conducted with swift, quiet efficiency. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the Duke, her husband, did not kiss her. He simply took her hand, his grasp firm and cool, and tucked it into the crook of his arm. "Your Grace," he said, his voice neutral. It was not a term of endearment. It was a statement of her new reality. The journey north to Ravenhall took 4 days. They travelled in the Duke's coach, a vehicle of exquisite craftsmanship and sombre luxury. For the most part, they travelled in silence. It was not an awkward silence, but a companionable one. The Duke read books from a small travelling library, and Penelope watched the rolling hills of England unfurl outside her window. He was a considerate travelling companion. He ensured she was comfortable, that the inns they stopped at were the best available, that her privacy was respected. At night, they took separate suites of rooms. He was scrupulously, almost clinically, correct in his behaviour. He was adhering to the terms of their agreement. A partnership. Nothing more. Penelope found she did not mind. The silence gave her time to think, to adjust to the seismic shift in her existence. 2 weeks ago, she had been Miss Darthorpe, a poor relation facing a future of bleak servitude. Now she was the Duchess of Whitchurch. The title felt like a costume she had not yet learned how to wear. She had sent a brief formal note to Lucien, informing him of her marriage. She did not have to imagine his apoplectic fury. She could almost feel it, vibrating across the hundreds of miles between them. The threat he held over her was gone, neutralized by the sheer power of the man sitting opposite her. The sense of relief was so profound, it was almost dizzying. For the first time in her adult life, she was safe. As they travelled further north, the landscape changed. The gentle, rolling hills of the south gave way to wilder, more dramatic scenery. The sky seemed larger, the air cleaner. On the fourth day, the coach turned off the main road and onto a private drive that wound its way through a dense wood. "We are approaching Raven Knoll," the Duke said, closing his book. Penelope leaned forward, peering through the window. After another mile, the trees thinned, and she saw it. Raven Knoll was not a house. It was a geological event. It rose from the rugged Northumberland landscape as if it had been pushed up from the earth itself, a sprawling masterpiece of grey stone, mullioned windows, and castellated towers. It was magnificent, austere, and profoundly intimidating. It did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress, brooding under the vast, pale sky. It seemed to be holding its breath. The coach clattered into a great stone courtyard and drew to a halt. The front doors, massive slabs of ancient oak, swung open, and the staff began to assemble on the steps. They were a formidable line of black and grey, their faces impassive, their eyes curious. The Duke alighted and turned to help her down. His hand was warm and steady on hers. For a moment, as she stood on the gravel, looking up at the silent ranks of servants and the imposing facade of the house, a wave of panic washed over her. What was she doing here? She, Penelope Darthorpe, who had spent her life in small, shabby rooms, was now meant to be the mistress of this colossal, unwelcoming place. As if sensing her hesitation, the Duke's grip on her arm tightened fractionally. "They are more afraid of you than you are of them," he murmured, his voice for her ears alone. She looked at him, surprised. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of something. Understanding, perhaps. He was right. To them, she was an unknown quantity, a new power to be navigated. She took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and lifted her chin. She had faced down Lucienne Darthorpe. She could face a line of servants. They ascended the steps together. At the top stood a tall, severe-looking woman in a black bombazine dress, a chatelaine of keys hanging from her waist. Her grey hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her cheekbones. "Your Grace," she said, her voice as starched as her collar, executing a perfect, rigid curtsy. "Mrs. Graves," the Duke said. "This is the Duchess, your new mistress." Mrs. Graves's gaze flickered over Penelope, cool and assessing. It took in the plain travelling dress, the unadorned hair, the lack of jewels. Penelope could feel herself being weighed and found wanting. "Your Grace," Mrs. Graves repeated, this time to Penelope, her curtsy a fraction less deep. Penelope met the housekeeper's gaze directly. "Mrs. Graves," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "I look forward to working with you." The tour of the house was a blur of echoing corridors, vast, dust-sheeted drawing rooms, and endless portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The house was immaculately clean, but utterly devoid of life. The air was cold and still. The furniture was formal and uncomfortable. It felt like a museum, not a home. Finally, they were shown to their chambers. "The Duke's rooms are in the West Wing, Your Grace," Mrs. Graves informed her. "These are the Duchess's apartments." The suite was opulent, with a large sitting room, a bedroom dominated by a canopied bed large enough for 6, and a dressing room. It was all impeccably correct, and as impersonal as a room at an inn. Her husband would sleep in a different wing of the house. The terms of their agreement made manifest in architecture. When the housekeeper had gone, leaving Penelope alone in the vast, silent room, the full weight of her new life settled upon her. She walked to the window and looked out. The view was of a formal garden, its geometric patterns overgrown and neglected. And beyond it, the wild, rolling moors stretched to the horizon. It was a beautiful, lonely landscape. She felt a pang of something sharp and painful. Not regret, but a profound sense of dislocation. She had exchanged one form of isolation for another. A grander, more comfortable isolation, to be sure, but isolation nonetheless. She had spent her youth caring for others. Now there was no one left to care for. Only this great empty house and the cold, distant man who was her husband. The first few weeks at Raven Knoll passed in a haze of quiet routine. Penelope rose early, breakfasted alone in a small, cheerless morning room, and then began the slow, methodical process of understanding her new domain. She did not issue grand orders or demand sweeping changes. Instead, she watched, and she listened. She walked the corridors of the great house, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floors. She learned that Mrs. Graves, the formidable housekeeper, ran the house with tyrannical efficiency, but that her severity was a shield for a deep-seated fear of change. She learned that Agnes, the young maid assigned to her, was shy but kind, and desperately missed her family in the village. She learned that the gardener, a taciturn man named Thomas, grieved for the once magnificent gardens his late master had loved. Her husband, the Duke, remained a distant, solitary figure. He spent his days in his study, or riding out across the estate, managing the vast network of farms and tenancies that were his responsibility. They met only at dinner. Those first dinners were excruciating. They sat at opposite ends of a dining table that could have seated 30, the vast expanse of polished mahogany between them a chasm. A footman stood silently at each corner of the room. The conversation was stilted, formal, and brief. "Was your day satisfactory, Your Grace?" she would ask. "It was productive," he would reply. "And yours?" "I am becoming acquainted with the house." And that would be all. The rest of the meal would be consumed in silence, broken only by the clink of silver on porcelain. Penelope endured it for a week. Then, one evening, as they were about to sit, she stopped. "Your Grace," she said, her voice calm. Jonathan paused, one hand on the back of his chair. "Yes?" "I find this arrangement inefficient." One of his dark eyebrows rose. "Inefficient?" "The distance is impractical for conversation, and it requires 4 footmen to be in attendance when one would suffice. It is a waste of their time and our comfort." She looked down the gleaming length of the table. "If we were to sit closer, perhaps at one end, it would be more civilized." The footmen froze, their faces carefully blank. Mrs. Graves, who always supervised the dinner service from the doorway, looked scandalized. No one questioned the Duke's arrangements. Jonathan looked at her, his expression unreadable. He looked at the vast table, then back at her. For a long moment, he said nothing. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Penelope held her breath, certain she had overstepped. Then he gave a curt nod. A sensible observation. See to it, Mrs. Graves. He then walked to the side of the table, pulled out a chair much closer to her own, and sat. Will this suffice? Yes, Your Grace. Thank you. She took her own seat, her heart beating a little faster. It was a small victory, but it felt momentous. That night, the silence between them was different. The chasm had been bridged, if only by a few feet. The conversation was still sparse, but it felt less strained. The next day, she sought out Mrs. Graves in her office, a small, meticulously tidy room filled with ledgers and account books. Mrs. Graves, Penelope began, I would like to see the household accounts. The housekeeper stiffened. His Grace has always reviewed the accounts himself. I am sure he has, Penelope said gently. But the Duke has charged me with the running of this house. I cannot do so effectively if I am not aware of its expenditures. It is not a matter of questioning your management, but of understanding it. She did not demand. She requested. She did not criticize. She asked for help. After a moment of internal struggle, visible in the tightening of her jaw, Mrs. Graves pushed the heavy ledger across the desk. Penelope spent the next week in the estate office, poring over the books. She found what she expected. Impeccable records, but no soul. The estate ran like a well-oiled machine, efficient and cold. There were no allowances for small comforts, no budget for anything beyond the bare necessities of a grand household. The garden budget, she noted, had been cut to almost nothing 10 years ago. Her next project was the library. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high, with soaring arched windows and thousands of books. But it was cold and dusty, the furniture shrouded in white cloths. It was clear no one had used it in years. She spent a full day there alone, simply walking the aisles, running her fingers over the leather-bound spines. She found sections on agriculture, engineering, and law, the Duke's responsibilities. But tucked away in a quiet corner, she found something else. Shelves of books on botany, on architecture, on Italian poetry. The pages were worn, the corners turned down. These were not for show. These had been loved. She found a book on the gardens of Tuscany, lying open on a reading stand, a thin ribbon marking a place. It was dated a decade ago. A fine layer of dust covered it. She instructed Agnes to help her remove the dust sheets. They spent 2 days airing the room, polishing the wood, and cleaning the great windows until they sparkled. She did not change the furniture's arrangement, but by uncovering it, by letting in the light, she changed the room's entire character. It ceased to be a tomb and began to feel like a living space again. That evening, when the Duke returned from his ride, he passed the open library doors and stopped. He stood in the doorway, looking in. The late afternoon sun streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the rich colors of the book bindings and the warm wood of the shelves. Penelope was seated in one of the large leather armchairs, a book in her lap. He said nothing, but she felt his presence. She looked up. Their eyes met across the room. "I hope you do not mind, Your Grace," she said. It seemed a shame for such a beautiful room to go unused. He walked slowly into the library, his gaze sweeping over the uncovered furniture, the gleaming surfaces. He ran a hand along a shelf of books on botany. "My brother and I used to spend hours in here," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He was the one with the passion for gardens. He had grand plans for this place. It was the first time he had mentioned his brother. Penelope knew from Lady Persis that the previous duke, a younger, more vibrant man, had died in a riding accident 10 years prior. Jonathan had inherited the title unexpectedly. "He had excellent taste," she said quietly, gesturing to the books. The Duke picked up the volume on Tuscan gardens that she had left on the reading stand. He traced the embossed title with his finger. He wanted to build a terraced Italian garden on the south slope. He had the drawings and everything. He fell silent, lost in a memory. The house, Penelope thought, had not just been holding its breath. It had been holding his grief. "It is a beautiful idea," she said. He looked at her then, a long, searching look. "Yes," he said, almost to himself. It was. He did not stay, but something had shifted between them. The library became a neutral ground. Sometimes in the evenings, he would join her there. They would sit in the comfortable armchairs on either side of the cold hearth, reading their own books in a shared, peaceful silence. One evening, Penelope looked up from her book to find him watching her, a strange expression on his face. "What is it, Your Grace?" He seemed to hesitate, then spoke. "My name is Jonathan." The two words fell into the quiet room with the weight of stones. It was not a command, but an offering, a small, tentative step across the space that separated them. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was the first time in her life a man had asked her to be his equal, not his subordinate or his caregiver. "Penelope," she replied, her voice soft. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement. The almost smile touched his lips again. The transaction was over. A relationship, fragile and new, was beginning. She started to reclaim the garden. She began with a small, walled kitchen garden near the back of the house, consulting with Thomas, the gruff gardener. At first, he was suspicious, resistant to her ideas. But when he saw that she listened to his advice, that she respected his knowledge of the soil and the climate, he slowly began to thaw. He showed her his father's old notebooks, filled with plans and planting schedules. Together, they drew up a new plan. Penelope used her own pin money, the generous allowance the Duke had settled on her, to order new seeds and tools. Soon, the neglected patch of earth began to show signs of life. Neat rows of vegetables appeared. Herbs scented the air. Jonathan would sometimes watch her from his study window. He saw her on her knees in the dirt, her plain dress protected by a canvas apron, her hands gloved, her face smudged with earth. She was not playing at being a gardener. She was working. She was creating. She was bringing something back to life. And as the garden grew, so did the house. Penelope asked Mrs. Graves for permission to bring flowers into the rooms. At first, it was just a small vase on a hall table. Then a bowl of roses in the morning room. The scent of living things began to permeate the sterile air. The servants, seeing these small changes, began to unbend. Smiles became more frequent. The house began to feel less like a fortress and more like a home. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It bore Lucien's familiar, arrogant script. Penelope's hand trembled as she opened it. He wrote that he would be in the north on business and intended to pay them a visit. It was not a request. It was a declaration. The old fear, the familiar dread, coiled in her stomach. She had been free for months, but the architect of her former prison was about to walk through her gates. She found Jonathan in the library. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. He is not welcome here. We cannot refuse him without causing a great deal of gossip, Penelope said, her voice strained. He is my cousin. He is a blackguard and a bully, Jonathan stated flatly. He looked at her, at the fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to conceal. Very well, let him come, but he will be a guest in your house, Penelope. You will receive him as the Duchess of Whitchurch, and I will be by your side. The use of her name, the quiet promise of his support, was a balm to her frayed nerves. She was not alone this time. Lucian Darthorpe arrived at Ravenknoll like a foul wind disturbing a tranquil afternoon. He swept into the great hall, his eyes taking in the polished floors, the vase of fresh flowers on the hall table, the air of quiet, ordered life. His gaze landed on Penelope, who stood at the top of the stairs, waiting for him. He had expected to find her diminished, a drab little mouse lost in the grandeur of her new cage. Instead, he saw a woman transformed. She was still dressed simply, in a gown of dark green that brought out the warmth in her hazel eyes, but she wore it with an air of quiet confidence he had never seen before. She was no longer Miss Darthorpe, the poor relation. She was the Duchess, and she looked it. Lucienne, she said, her voice perfectly even. She did not come down to greet him. She made him come to her. Penelope? Or should I say, Your Grace? He purred, ascending the stairs. You are looking... well, marriage agrees with you. There was a faint, mocking emphasis on the word marriage. My husband and I are pleased to welcome you to Ravenknoll, she said, ignoring his tone. I will have Mrs. Graves show you to your room. His visit was a masterpiece of subtle psychological warfare. At dinner, he regaled them with gossip from London, his stories filled with veiled insults and sly insinuations. He complimented Penelope on how rested she looked, as if her previous life had been one of unbearable toil under her own family's roof. He spoke of Clara, mentioning a rumour that her engagement to a wealthy baronet might be on shaky ground, a clear, if subtle reminder of the power he once wielded. Jonathan remained silent through most of the meal, a thunderous, imposing presence at the head of the table. He watched Lucian with a look of cold, undisguised contempt. Lucian, however, seemed to thrive on the tension. He directed most of his conversation to Penelope, constantly attempting to draw her back into their old dynamic, to remind her of her place as the subservient, powerless spinster. "I confess I was surprised by your sudden marriage, Penny," he said, leaning back in his chair with a glass of wine. "To the Duke of Whitchurch, no less. A great coup. You always were a dark horse." "My marriage is not a coup, Lucian," Penelope said, her voice dangerously quiet. "It is my life." Of course, he said, smiling his reptilian smile. "And what a life! This house, it is magnificent, though I imagine the upkeep must be staggering." He let the word hang in the air, a hint at financial burdens. The next day, he cornered Penelope in the newly revived library. Jonathan was out on the estate. "This is all very grand, Penny," he said, gesturing around the room. "You have done well for yourself, far better than you deserved." "What do you want, Lucian?" she asked, refusing to engage with his provocations. His smile vanished. "What I want is what I am owed. You escaped me. You cheated me of the satisfaction of seeing you put in your proper place. But you are still a Darthorpe, and you still have a duty to your family." "My duty is to my husband." "Your husband is a very wealthy man," Lucian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "and I find myself in a temporary financial difficulty. A small matter of some unfortunate investments. A loan, a significant one, from the Duke would solve all my problems." Penelope stared at him, aghast. "You want me to ask my husband for money for you?" "Why not? He owes you something for the use of your company, and you owe me. You owe me for your comfortable new life. If it were not for my encouragement, you would be in Norfolk right now, darning the vicar's socks." "I will not ask him," she said flatly. Lucian's eyes narrowed. "You will, or I will find a way to make you regret it. That information about your father, it has not simply disappeared. A duke's wife with a thief for a father. The Ton would adore such a scandal. It might not have the same legal teeth now, but the stain would remain. It would tarnish his precious name." The old threat, the same ugly weapon, resharpened. But this time, it felt different. It was not just her family's name he was threatening now. It was Jonathan's, the man who had offered her sanctuary, the man who had shown her a respect she had never known. She would not allow this vile creature to harm him. "You will leave Raven Knoll," she said, her voice shaking with a cold rage she had not known she possessed. "You will leave tomorrow morning." Lucian laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I will leave when I have what I want. You will speak to the Duke, or you will face the consequences." He turned and walked out, leaving her standing in the silent, sunlit room, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fury. That night she could not sleep. Lucian's threat echoed in her mind. She could not ask Jonathan for money. It would be a betrayal of the trust that was so tentatively growing between them. But to defy Lucian meant risking a scandal that would humiliate her husband and drag his name through the mud. She felt the walls of her new life closing in on her, the shadow of her old one stretching all the way to this remote fortress. She had been a fool to think she could ever truly escape. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She rose from her bed, pulling on a warm dressing gown. She had to tell him. She had to confess everything, the full, sordid story of her father's failing accounts and Lucien's blackmail. She owed him the truth, no matter the cost. If he sent her away, if he despised her for bringing this trouble to his door, then so be it. She would not, could not deceive him. She made her way through the silent, sleeping house, her single candle casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The west wing was unfamiliar territory. She had never been here. She found his study, the door slightly ajar, a thin line of light spilling into the corridor. He was still awake. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Jonathan was sitting at his large desk, a ledger open before him, a glass of brandy at his elbow. He looked up as she entered, his expression surprised. "Penelope? Is something wrong?" She closed the door behind her and stood before him, her hands clasped tightly together. "I have to tell you something, Your Grace." She had reverted to the formal title, a subconscious shield. "Something I should have told you before we were married." He leaned back in his chair, his grey eyes watchful, patient. He did not speak. He simply waited. And so the story poured out of her, the story of her father's last years, his confusion, his grief, the muddled accounts, the small sums of money that had gone astray, not through malice, but through a failing mind. And Lucien's discovery of it, his cruel, calculated use of it as a weapon to control her, to force her into the match with Mr. Finch. She told him everything, her voice low and steady, though her heart felt as if it might beat its way out of her chest. She did not make excuses for her father or for herself. She simply laid out the truth, piece by painful piece. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. She kept her eyes fixed on a point on the carpet, unable to meet his gaze. She braced herself for the explosion, for the cold anger, the contempt, the dismissal. She had brought scandal and deceit into his clean, ordered world. He did not look guilty. That was what she noticed most sharply. He did not look angry. Instead, when he finally spoke, his voice was unnervingly calm. "I know." Penelope's head snapped up. "You—" "What?" "I know," he repeated. "I have known since before we were married." He gestured to a set of papers on his desk. "My man of business, Mr. Davies, is exceptionally thorough. The moment I decided to approach you, I had him make a full inquiry into your family's circumstances, including your cousin." She stared at him, her mind reeling. "But how?" "Lucien Darthorpe is not as clever as he believes. He has debts all over London. It was not difficult for Davies to find disgruntled creditors willing to talk. The story of your father's discrepancies was part of the gossip. Davies investigated. He found what you have just told me. Not fraud, but the sad confusion of an old man. The total sum was negligible. I had Davies settle the accounts quietly. It was done a week before our wedding." Penelope sank into the chair opposite his desk, her legs suddenly unable to support her. He had known. All this time he had known. The weapon Lucien had been holding over her head was a phantom, an empty threat. Jonathan had disarmed him before she had even set foot in Raven Knoll. "Why?" she whispered. Why didn't you tell me? He looked at her, and for the first time, the mask of ducal control slipped, revealing the man beneath. His sea-grey eyes were filled with an emotion she could not name, something deep and complex and intensely vulnerable, because it was not my truth to tell, he said, his voice low. It was yours. I could remove the threat, but I could not remove the burden. I had to wait for you to trust me enough to share it, for you to believe that I would not judge you for the actions of others. He paused, and the next words seemed to cost him a great deal. And because the reason I married you was not as simple as I made it sound. It was not for a duchess to run your house. I have a housekeeper for that, he said, a faint, wry twist to his lips. No, Penelope, I married you because I saw you. At that ball, in that city full of noise and vanity, I saw a woman of immense grace, of quiet strength, of a dignity that had been forged in fire. I saw you spending your entire life caring for others, and I felt a profound desire to see someone, for once, care for you. He stood up and walked around the desk, coming to stand before her. He reached out and gently took her hands in his. They were warm and strong. I did not offer you my heart because I did not believe I had one left to give, he said, his voice raw with a grief that was 10 years old. My brother's death, it hollowed me out. I thought all I had left was duty. But since you have been here, this house has started to breathe again. You have brought life back, not just to the gardens and the rooms, but to me. He looked down at their joined hands. I find that my heart is not as empty as I believed. Tears she had refused to shed for Lucian now welled in her eyes, tears of shock and overwhelming relief, of a joy so profound it was painful. He had not married her for convenience. He had married her for her. He had seen past the grey dress, the quiet demeanour, the spinster of 40, and he had seen the woman she was. He had seen her. Jonathan, she whispered, the name a prayer on her lips. He lifted one hand and gently, so gently, brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. I believe your cousin is expecting an answer regarding his loan, he said, his voice regaining some of its familiar, dry authority, but his eyes were full of warmth. I think perhaps we should give him one, together. The next morning, Lucian was summoned to the library. He entered with a smug, expectant air, assuming Penelope had capitulated. He found her standing by the fireplace, and the Duke seated behind a large mahogany desk. The room was bright with morning sun, but the atmosphere was glacial. Lucienne, Penelope said, her voice clear and strong. Thank you for joining us. Your Grace. Duke, Lucienne said with a nod. I trust you have had time to consider my proposition. We have, Jonathan said, his voice like the crack of ice. He gestured to the chair opposite the desk. Be seated. Lucienne sat, his smugness wavering slightly under the Duke's cold gaze. Penelope has informed me of your request for a loan, Jonathan began. She has also informed me of the leverage you thought you possessed. A flicker of unease crossed Lucienne's face. A private family matter. Indeed, the Duke said. So private, in fact, that I had my man of business resolve it 2 months ago. He pushed a thin folio of papers across the desk. These are the settled accounts from your late uncle's estate. All debts paid. All discrepancies reconciled. Vouchers are all in order. Your leverage, Mr. Darthorpe, is gone. Lucien stared at the papers, his face draining of all colour. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked from the Duke's implacable face to Penelope's calm, steady one. He saw no fear there, only a quiet, resolute strength he had never recognized. He had been utterly, comprehensively outmaneuvered. The scandal, he stammered, a last desperate grasp for power. The story? What story? Jonathan asked, his voice dangerously soft. The story of a grieving elderly man who became confused in his last years. The story of a nephew who tried to use that sadness to blackmail his cousin into a forced marriage. By all means, Mr. Darthorpe, tell that story to the ton. I am quite certain I know whose reputation will be in tatters by the end of it. It was over. Lucien saw it in their eyes. His weapon had been a wooden sword all along. He had no power here. He was nothing but a petty, grasping man, exposed in the clear, unforgiving light of day. He slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow, defeated shell. It was not a grand, dramatic defeat. It was a quiet, pathetic crumbling. And in that moment, Penelope felt a flicker not of triumph, but of pity. He was just a small man, driven by fear and envy. You will leave Ravenknoll within the hour, the Duke said, his voice final. You are no longer welcome here. You are no longer a part of this family. Lucien did not argue. He simply stood, his face pale and drawn, and walked out of the room without another word. The door closed behind him, and the silence he left was clean and absolute. Penelope let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Jonathan, who was watching her, his expression gentle. He rose from his desk and came to her, taking her hands in his. It is over, he said. Yes, she whispered. He led her to the large window that overlooked the gardens. Below, the first green shoots of the spring planting were pushing their way through the dark earth. Life was returning. You are safe here, Penelope, he said. You are home. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture that spoke more than words. For the first time, she believed it. She was home. Epilogue. 1 year later. The autumn sun cast a long, golden light over the gardens of Ravenknoll. The air was crisp, scented with wood smoke and damp earth. The geometric beds, once choked with weeds, were now a riot of late-blooming roses, asters, and chrysanthemums. The kitchen garden was heavy with pumpkins and squash. The house, which had once brooded under the vast Northumberland sky, now seemed to soak in the sunlight, its grey stone warmed to a soft honey colour. It was a house at peace. Penelope, Duchess of Whitchurch, stood on the newly completed south terrace, looking out over the rolling moors. The Italian garden her husband's brother had dreamed of was no longer just a drawing in a book. Over the past year, she and Jonathan, working with Thomas and a team of local craftsmen, had brought it to life. Stone walls curved gracefully down the slope, creating 3 levels planted with lavender, rosemary, and young cypress trees that would one day stand tall against the wind. It was a place of beauty and remembrance, a tribute to a lost brother, and a testament to a new beginning. She wore a simple dress of deep claret wool, the wind catching a stray, silver-threaded strand of her hair. She was no longer invisible. She was vibrant. Her face, which had been a study in serene neutrality, was now expressive, quick to smile. Her eyes, which had been watchful, were now warm. At 41, she was more beautiful than she had ever been at 21. She heard the crunch of boots on the gravel path and turned. Jonathan was walking towards her, a heavy tartan shawl folded over his arm. The 48-year-old Duke no longer looked like a man hollowed out by grief. His shoulders were relaxed. The severe lines of his face softened. The almost smile was now a frequent, genuine expression, especially when he looked at his wife. "The evening is growing cool," he said, his voice the familiar, low rumble that was now the sound of home. He came and stood beside her, carefully draping the warm shawl over her shoulders. His hands lingered there for a moment, a gesture of casual, profound affection. "Thank you," she said, pulling the soft wool closer. "I was just admiring our work." "Our work," he repeated, his gaze following hers over the terraced garden. "It is good." They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the shadows lengthen across the moors. It was a silence born not of a lack of things to say, but of a deep, abiding understanding that needed no words. Theirs was not a passionate, tempestuous love affair, but something quieter, deeper, and far more enduring. It was a partnership of mind and soul, built on a foundation of respect and cemented by a chosen, deliberate love. "Lady Persis writes that Clara is happy," Penelope said, breaking the silence. "Her baronet adores her, apparently, and Thomas is doing well at school." "I am glad," Jonathan said simply. He had ensured that both of Penelope's charges were well provided for, quietly, and without fanfare, as was his way. Penelope turned to him, a soft smile on her lips. "You have given me so much, Jonathan. A home, a family, safety." He met her gaze, his sea-grey eyes full of a love that was steady and sure. "You, Penelope," he said, his voice quiet but intense, "have given me everything else. You gave me back my life." He reached out and tucked the stray strand of her hair back into place, his fingers gentle against her temple. It was the kind of small, intimate gesture that had come to define their life together. She had spent her youth caring for others, a life measured in duties and obligations. At 40, a duke had decided it was her turn. But it was not a turning of tables, not a simple reversal of roles. He had not made her a queen to be served. He had made her his partner, his equal, his friend. He had not just cared for her. He had seen her. And in being truly seen, she had finally, fully become herself. She leaned into his touch, her heart full. The sun dipped below the horizon, and in the twilight, the lights of Raven-Knoll began to glow, a warm and welcoming beacon in the vast, wild landscape. Thank you for listening to the story, all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from, and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.